With the NBA season getting started soon, that also means that we're going to learn a lot about these teams. We're going to figure out who's good, who's not, what adjustments need to be made, and with that comes the possibility of trades. What are some trades that we could possibly see this upcoming season? First up, let's talk about the LA Lakers. Now, this is something I mentioned briefly in a couple of other videos, but their situation in terms of their payroll, in terms of how their roster is structured, in terms of what their goals are for this season, to me, means that it's very, very unlikely that they keep this same roster throughout the entirety of the season. This could very easily be the final year that LeBron is in the NBA, could possibly even be the last year that he's in LA and just be going and playing for a different team next year. This is a really big year for the Lakers, and I honestly believe that they have a chance to win the title this year. With how good they were post-trade deadline last year. Obviously, they struggled against Denver in the postseason, but everybody struggled against Denver in the postseason, and they're going to be a top-tier contender, in my opinion, this season. And with that comes the need to maybe make some aggressive moves at the deadline. When you look at the way that they've structured some of their contracts, whether it be D'Angelo Russell, whether it be Rui Hachimura, it's not that difficult for them to put together a couple of contracts that make sense in exchange for, a star player. They can get some draft compensation that they can send out this year, and they can send out a couple of contracts and really add that final piece to the puzzle. Because as much as I like this Lakers team, I like their size, I like their physicality, I like what they can potentially do defensively, there is, I think, a need for a little bit more perimeter offense beyond what you can maybe potentially count on from someone like D'Angelo Russell. And even though they have Austin Reeves, and of course they have Anthony Davis and LeBron, it feels like they're still one more semi-star piece short. And that's definitely a team as we get closer to the deadline. If they're healthy, and if, as I expect them to be, they're one of the best teams in the conference, they're probably going to look to be aggressive in trying to add to this roster, just strictly based off of how they've structured their contracts and kind of a need that it feels like they still have on the offensive end of the floor. Kind of in that same category, let's talk about the Golden State Warriors as well, because of course they made the move this offseason, going out and getting Chris Paul, sending away Jordan Poole, restructuring their roster in that way, trying to figure out how Chris Paul is now going to be integrated into this team. But going along with that, I do still think there's a possibility of them doing the, young guys in exchange for a veteran trade that's been rumored for a little while now at this point. Obviously they did that with Poole and Chris Paul, but Kuminga is still there, Moody is still there, they still have some future assets that they could trade away, and clearly they've started to go in that direction. They traded away Wiseman, they traded away Jordan Poole, partially because of financial reasons, but this whole two timelines thing where they try and thread the needle and they try and have a bunch of young guys and still try and push for a title, clearly they've gone away from that. And their goal number one right now as a franchise is to continue to try and be championship contenders as long as Steph is awesome. And he's still awesome. He's still MVP caliber player. That is indicated, that kind of goal and mindset is indicated in the fact that they did bring back Draymond, that they moved Jordan Poole basically so that they would be able to bring back Draymond. And I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the season, Kuminga, Moody, those guys are no longer on the roster, and they're looking at bringing in, another wing, another front court player maybe that allows them a little bit more versatility in their lineup choices. There's a lot of different stuff that Golden State could still possibly add. I think they really, really did explore trying to bring in Drew Holiday in exchange for Chris Paul, but more so in this youth movement versus veterans kind of conversation that we always have about Golden State. Unless we see a significant jump from Kuminga or Moody during this season, I wouldn't be surprised to see either of those guys moved as well. But now let's get to some specific players, right? There's a handful of guys that aren't really getting talked about that much as trade possibilities because they've been kind of overshadowed by the Damian Lillard, James Harden, potentially Giannis, potentially Joel Embiid group of stars. There's that next level underneath those guys, and there's a handful of them that I think realistically could get moved this season. And the first one is Pascal Siakam in Toronto. This is just an all-around weird situation. I did a full Toronto video pretty recently talking about not really understanding the direction of their team, what they're trying to do, where they're trying to go, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that Siakam doesn't have a new contract at this point, and it's really hard for me to believe that a team in Toronto that, I think, they're going to be between 40 and 45 wins. I don't think they're going to be one of the top tier teams in the conference, and I think their ceiling is somewhere in that 40 to 45 win range, and it's hard for me to believe that they're going to go through the season with Pascal Siakam on an expiring contract and risk potentially losing him in free agency for nothing a year after losing Fred VanVleet in free agency for nothing. And that to me makes me wonder if, let's say Toronto is maybe struggling a little bit more than they expect to at the deadline. They're 10 games under 500 at the deadline. They realize this season is not going to be what maybe they had hoped that it would be. Pascal Siakam as a mid-season trade candidate is a really interesting, possibility because he's different than most of the other guys you normally trade for. Most of the time it's guards, high scoring guys that are going to be, perimeter primary offensive players. And Siakam's a very good offensive player, but there's a lot of versatility that he provides, and having a front court player like that available at the deadline, like I said, is a little bit of a unique situation. And so given the situation in Toronto, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Pascal Siakam is potentially in trade rumors really over the next couple of months. And unless he ends up signing an extension or they're very confident that he's going to re-sign and stay with them, I think he's someone that they absolutely could look to move for value as they kind of move into a different era of Toronto Raptors basketball. Going right along with that is Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland. Now, this one is probably more likely to be an off-season situation because of the contract situation there in Cleveland. He's not expiring this year, it's the year after. And I've talked about this before as well in terms of there being a lot of pressure on Cleveland to have postseason success because they didn't have any last year, and Donovan Mitchell made no promises to Cleveland when he got there that he was going to stay. And that was the risk that they, as a smaller market team, took when they traded for Donovan Mitchell. But there is a disaster scenario here where maybe there's some injuries in Cleveland. Maybe they're like a 500 team a couple weeks before the deadline, and they realize, okay, we took this big swing with Donovan Mitchell. We can get basically all that stuff back from another team if we trade him at the deadline. Why don't we just trade him and go back to kind of our like Darius Garland, Evan Mobley group here, rather than really trying to push some chips into the middle of the table like they did with the Mitchell deal? And basically they can just reverse the Donovan Mitchell trade by trading him away potentially at the deadline this year. And again, that comes with the pressure of expecting that he could look to go somewhere else in 2025. And that's really the main concern here for Cleveland, is what Donovan Mitchell's long-term commitment to the franchise looks like. And if you're winning and you look like a 50-win team, a possible conference finals team, then you're okay taking the risk on him potentially leaving because you feel like the success has a good chance of convincing him to stay. But if you're not as good, then all of a sudden you get really concerned. And then the last one here is definitely a wild card one, but it's a situation I'm going to continue to keep an eye on, and that's Trae Young in Atlanta. Now, this has a couple of different angles to it. One that's more realistic is I think it's very possible that Atlanta looks at their roster and thinks that they would be better off with assets in exchange for Trae Young than actually having Trae Young on the roster. They've got DeJounte Murray, they've got a handful of other guys that are interesting, but clearly, unless Murray and Young are just out of control fantastic, like literally the best backcourt in the entire league this year, the ceiling on this team is not, a conference finals team. It's just not. And if you're in that situation and there's really no, there's not a ton of upside to this group moving forward, at what point do you really explore trading away Trae Young for what I still would expect to be a good amount to potentially a lot of assets? The other avenue to this would be potentially if Trae Young is unhappy and he wants to ask out, he doesn't want to be in Atlanta anymore, he wants to go to a more winning situation. But I think honestly, more realistically, Atlanta could look at their own situation and think, why don't we get ahead of this a little bit? Why don't we see what our roster looks like without Trae Young? Because with him, it's clear that we're not like a contending team. And I'm not saying you necessarily have to look like a contender this year if you're Atlanta, but it's kind of like the Toronto situation where you look at the roster, you look at how they've changed things over the years, and you wonder, what's the plan here? Where are we going? What are we doing? And if they don't have real clear answers to that, and you're paying someone as much as you're going to be paying Trae Young over the next couple of seasons, you could potentially get value out of him and maybe, try this all over again. I think it's an option worth exploring because, again, I don't know where the ceiling is. I don't know where the upside and the growth of this team is. And that's one I'm keeping an eye on, whether it be at this deadline or, over the next couple of years. And as always, I'm sure there's like 5 significant trade situations that I didn't put on the list that could very easily happen this year, which is why I love the season and I cannot wait for it to get started.